5 mil. Elevation, 325 mil. Ready? Fire.
Guns, the essence of military power. Artillery is the god of war, so said Joseph Stalin. Napoleon put it rather differently. It is with artillery, he said, that war is made. But both men were making the same point. It is the big guns that have dominated the battlefield in modern times. Yet the gun has probably changed less than any other weapon of war in the 6 centuries of its existence. Of course, nowadays it's likely to be breech-loaded, made of steel, and frequently with tracks and its own engine. Its ammunition has been revolutionized and its range and accuracy formidably increased. But essentially it remains today what it was in the 14th century. A hollow metal tube, closed at one end, out of which an explosive compound fires a projectile at whatever target a commander chooses. And almost from the start, its impact has been devastating. The ordeal of living through an artillery bombardment is an experience the survivor never forgets.
I thought at first it wouldn't last very long. I thought that if you had a concentrated bombardment, it would only last for 2 or 3 minutes. But it went on for a couple of hours. And the whole of that time, we heard these shells rushing towards us. They seemed to be feeling a fiendish joy as they were coming to destroy us. After a bit, I just simply waited there, thinking that sooner or later one of them was bound to hit us, and that would be that.
It is a feeling of horror. So all your senses, like hearing and feeling, they are much stronger than in any ordinary position one is in. And also the sound, it howls, and then the crying of the wounded, and also the total helplessness. In a normal battle position, one can shoot back, but here one absolutely can do nothing, only wait, and one hopes that the bombardment will not be too long.
Gunfire need not be incessant to set soldiers' nerves trembling, as the American defenders of Khe Sanh discovered during its siege by the Viet Cong.
The shelling was sporadic, but very effective, because the portion of the hill we occupied, because of its topography, was only about perhaps 50 by 200 meters. And in that area, we had about 400 men. So most any place a shell landed, if the men weren't under cover, we suffered casualties. And these were big rounds. The result was that the average private in the trench could see only his own friends being killed and wounded, his own companions, as it were. The net result was a pretty serious morale problem. He never felt he was getting back, as it were, at the guy who was shooting at him.
Even in small wars, like the Falklands campaign of 1982, when neither side deployed many guns, artillery can still have a deadly impact on morale.
It certainly has a psychological effect, that there is no doubt. I don't think we killed an awful lot in the Falkland Islands, but we certainly took a psychological toll of them to such an extent that they didn't wish to go on. And of course, artillery is not just directed against a soldier eyeball-to-eyeball contact with an enemy. It is often directed against targets in depth. And whilst we fired a lot of artillery in support of the infantry attacking all the hills around Stanley, in very close support, often to within 150 meters of our own forces, the bulk of our effort was devoted to destroying their headquarters, their logistics, and their own gun positions. And I think this is what caused that sudden surrender by the Argentines outside Stanley in 1982.
The European discovery of gunpowder at the beginning of the 14th century launched one of the great technical revolutions of history. Gunpowder released combat from the limitations of muscle power allowed enemy to strike at enemy over distances greater than could be covered by spear or bow, and transformed siegecraft from a war of nerves to a test of strength. Traditional siege engines had thrown projectiles which hit wherever they fell, but the cannonball could be made to strike accurately and repeatedly at the foundations. The appearance of the new gunpowder weapons outside a besieged city soon came to mean that its fall was at hand. The most spectacular artillery success of the Middle Ages took place at Constantinople, then the largest fortified city in the Western world. In 1453, the Emperor Constantine XI, last of the Caesars, found himself besieged here by the huge army of the Ottoman Turks, under their young Sultan, Mehmet II. These towering walls were the city's principal defense, begun originally by the Emperor Theodosius II 1,000 years before. Studded with towers up to 40 feet high, they stretched 14 miles from the waters of the Golden Horn to the Sea of Marmara. They had shrugged off sieges often before, and they were massive enough to withstand attack by most contemporary artillery. But the artillery park that the Sultan's army now dragged within battering range of the city contained guns bigger and more destructive than any previously brought to the scene of a siege. At the Tower of London, another fortress built before the artillery age, there is a cannon of similar style and power to those that brought the walls of Theodosius tumbling down. It was shipped to London in the 1860s as a gift for Queen Victoria. There's an ironical twist to this story. The man who designed these great guns was a Hungarian called Urban, who in the first place offered them to the Christians in Constantinople. Only when his services had been rejected as being too expensive did he turn to the Turks. Now, the Turkish Sultan at once recognized what he was being offered, a war-winning weapon of devastating power. The weight of these cannon is quite colossal. The after part here, the breech, weighs nearly 9 tons, and the barrel 8 tons, and there were some that were even heavier. It's said that it took 60 oxen to drag each of Mehmet's cannon towards the walls of Constantinople. There were 200 attendants marching beside them, and another 250 going on ahead to smooth out the roads and strengthen the bridges. This is the kind of shot they would have fired. These gigantic stone cannonballs weigh 1/3 of a ton each, and they could travel up to a mile. "13 giant cannon, firing 4,000 times between April the 1st and May the 10th, 1453, overthrew the patient defensive work of centuries." Soon guns were appearing which in style were to set the pattern for the next 400 years. These, not Mehmet's monsters, were the weapons of the future. Pulled by horses, they could match in speed any marching army. And these were the guns with which Charles VIII of France blitzkrieged Italy in 1495. It was as though the cannon almost immediately found its natural dynamic form. The new guns displayed certain crucial improvements in design. They were now provided with elevating devices, in this case simple wedges, to allow variation of range. Twin projections just in front of the point of balance, called trunnions, allowed the gun to pivot. These were made possible because gun makers had now discovered how to cast the gun in a single piece of bronze. The new artillery of the Renaissance age was so much improved that guns for the first time began to decide the outcome of battle. But the siege remained artillery's main field of action, and siege gunners steadily learnt to perfect their craft. Cannelure, cutting a furrow along a wall's base, was a technique that brought many battlements down. Such techniques were elements in a duel between gunners and siege engineers, which was to be fought through a whole range of wars and campaigns, and which was to last into the present century. It even marked the outbreak of the First World War. And a later 20th century artillery siege took place here in northern France at the opening of the Second World War. This is part of the Maginot Line, the chain of concrete forts built by the French in the 1930s to guard their vulnerable frontier with Germany. Their armored casemates and retractable gun turrets gave these forts the appearance of stranded battleships. They were to prove not much more useful, for the Germans made their main thrust in 1940 far to the north, across the unfortified frontiers of Belgium. But they did mount a few token attacks on the line itself. This fort at La Ferté was one of the targets. The purpose of the attack was partly to keep the French from transferring its garrison to the battle in the north, and partly to let Dr. Goebbels' film crews show the German nation the might of the Wehrmacht. In its pitting of the power of artillery against the strength of fixed defenses, this was an old-fashioned siege, but the weight of firepower the Germans deployed gave the defenders no chance. After a bombardment by guns of all calibers, from medium to super heavy, the German infantry closed in for the final assault, much like foot soldiers of the Middle Ages storming the breach of a city wall. "210 Frenchmen died in this grisly little confrontation. The battered casemates and toppled cupolas are their memorial. They also commemorate one of the last episodes in a style of war which can be traced back in a direct line to the great set-piece sieges of the medieval world. But while siege gunners pursued their particular speciality, field gunners were making their weapons more directly useful to armies on campaign. The King's Troop Royal Horse Artillery is here demonstrating this far more significant role of the gun during the last 5 centuries. This is artillery working as one of the essential tools of the general in the field, and showing that it can do so at speed. This may look to us today just colorful ritual, but nothing better demonstrates the nature of the revolution that made artillery a dominant battlefield weapon. Horse artillery provided much color and dash, but it was the heavier field guns which more often brought the action of the day to a decision.
Ready! Fire!
When guns like these fired, the shock of discharge drove them leaping backwards. They had to be manhandled into their old position. They had to be re-aimed at the target by eye between each salvo. Recoil, running up, relaying, reloading, this burdensome sequence demanded much of the gunner's strength and skills.
Fire!
The ordeal the gunners had to endure was as nothing to the carnage they could inflict when their shot drove home into the enemy's massed ranks. Solid round shot, not much bigger than a modern tennis ball, could kill 8 or a dozen men at a time. Disintegrating projectiles, such as canister and grape, took the same toll on men as birdshot on a flight of partridges. As the 19th century drew on, and its satanic mills gave armies guns and shells in massive quantities, artillery spoke with ever greater power on battlefields. On those of the American Civil War, like Gettysburg, it was the guns that decided the issue. And it was the guns which now began to work with terrible effect on landscapes and on cities, the results by now being faithfully recorded by the camera. These images of Confederate strongholds, savaged by artillery and fire, have a very modern look about them. 50 years before Flanders, they are previews of the artillery landscapes of World War I. The design and shape of these projectiles give the clue to the next firepower revolution. Most of them are cast in steel, filled with high explosive and have mechanical fuses. Most important, they have become conical. The reason for that change of shape is explained by a single word: rifling. Late 19th century guns had steel barrels cut with spiral grooves that could keep a conical projectile traveling straight in a way the old smoothbore cannons did not. And there were other refinements. All these guns mark stages in the search for the perfect gun. The problem was how to select the right elements from the current technical ferment. And then, suddenly, one design team got it all together. In 1897, the French Army's artillery workshops at Puteaux produced the world's first truly modern gun. And this is it, the 75mm, known to its gunners as the Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. Now, all of its features had existed in previous guns, but never before had they been brought together with the same degree of mechanical reliability and efficiency. This gun is as lean, as fast, and as specialized as a Greyhound. For one thing, it was breech loading, so that no time was wasted ramming the shell down the barrel. And the breech mechanism was designed for rapid and complete opening and closing. Then its shells were propelled by cordite, the new propellant which left much less fouling in the barrel than the old black gunpowder and caused much less smoke on the battlefield. The shells were filled with one of the new generation of high explosives, lyddite, and fitted with a time fuse, accurate to within fractions of a second. Most importantly, the gun was mounted on a hydraulic platform with compressors to absorb the shock of recoil. As a result, the gun no longer needed to be realigned after each discharge. Together, these features gave a quite fantastic rate of fire. French gunners claimed 15 or 20 rounds a minute, which is faster than most soldiers can fire a rifle. It was not long before guns with similar features came into service throughout Europe. The new guns had one other crucial advantage. With their vastly increased range, they could now fire over the hill. It was a major revolution. Previously, gunners could only engage targets they could see. Now, they could fire at targets far out of sight. The French 75mm and similar guns, such as these British 18-pounders, had no sooner been brought into general service than they were called into action in earnest in the First World War. This war's phenomenally destructive character and long duration were largely the result of the recent artillery revolution. It was, above all, a gunner's war. It is part of the mythology of that war that the machine gun was the great killer of infantry. Actually, hospital statistics show that 2/3 of all wounds in all armies were caused by shells. It was gunfire which broke up the mass infantry attacks from the outset, and it was largely gunfire which drove infantry to dig themselves below ground for protection. More, the new powerful artillery produced an entirely different style of gunner's war from the face-to-face battles of the 19th century. With indirect fire, now standard practice, an entirely new role was created, that of the forward observation officer, with his signaller, far ahead of the guns, identifying targets from often dangerous observation posts.
The most common, of course, was the infantry trench. Then, once in Hebertown, we found a very good observation post from which we could see Goncourt, but it was too dangerous. We should have been killed at once had we been seen. But fortunately, there was a stump of a tree sticking about 6 feet high, left, standing, and a lot of rubble around because it had been very much destroyed. And we decided to call in the camouflage officer, and in one night he had taken away the tree, copied it exactly by camouflage, and arranged a way of entering it through the ground, and then we poked our heads up into this tree and found a little hole and saw all we wanted to see, and the Germans only looked on it as a broken tree. And then, of course, ruined villages, if there's anything left of the houses near the front line, you could invariably climb to the top floor and see through the broken tiles of the roof and that kind of thing. So you took every advantage you could of anything which was higher than ground level.
One particularly dangerous observation post was the air balloon, unconcealable from the enemy and therefore a prime target for his guns or aircraft. Communication with the ground was by direct telephone line, the information being then processed and sent back to the gun batteries. The Royal Flying Corps manned these balloons and also the aircraft which were used for the same purpose, particularly in the later years of the war. The observer spotted a target on the ground, located it on his map, then transmitted the information acquired by Morse code from a trailing aerial. Once the guns had fired, the airborne observer could signal corrections if the shells were not falling exactly on target. The infantryman was the principal victim of the volcanic bombardments of this war, though if the gunners did their work well, he was also at times the beneficiary.
One lived in a world where there were continuous explosions. Every now and again there would be a loud bang in the distance, rather like Guy Fawkes' Night in England. You'd see somebody over there was having fireworks. And then suddenly the fireworks would break out all around you. But when a real barrage started, it made a continuous roar of thunder that completely drowned and destroyed the casual shell fire of ordinary times. By the end of the war, they were very accurate indeed. The artillery put down the shells exactly where they liked, and you actually saw a curtain of shell bursts 200 or 300 yards in front of you, and you went as far as you could. It would certainly silence the enemy and make them keep their heads down, but it might kill them, or it might not. If it hadn't actually killed them, you then had to fight a very frightened German who'd been through a worse experience than you had.
It was artillery that made the landscapes of the First World War, those sloughs of despond and fields of ruin that survivors never forgot. A British Tommy wrote of Ypres,
"Before my eyes spread the martyred city. A concourse of shattered buildings clustered in the middle distance, with here and there a broken chimney stack or a decapitated church spire jutting a little above the rest. The place looked as though it had been left half finished to the elements. But this was only the superficial appearance of things, for every now and then, here and there, a shell burst among the rubble, demonstrating clearly the cause of the city's dire condition. It seemed a miracle that anyone could survive in that terrible place."
Ypres gave its name to the notorious salient, over which the British and Germans fought uninterruptedly for 4 years. Of the salient, an infantry officer wrote in 1917,
"What confronted us was a lunar landscape of shell craters, one touching another, filled with water and sludgy clay."
Scattered through the salient were zones of special danger, subject to constant bombardment, from which all signs of civilization had been swept away, and through which soldiers always hurried in their eagerness to reach the refuge of less open ground. An American officer wrote,
"This is a cowering war, with men huddled in little holes and caves, praying to escape the blows of giants who pound the earth with blind hammers."
There are still landscapes on the old Western Front which have never recovered from this blind hammering. This is a fragment of the battlefield of Verdun. Here in eastern France in 1916, the French and Germans fought the first pure artillery battle of history. It lasted 10 months. The Germans, who launched the battle, called it Operation Execution Place, and their executioner's tool was the big gun. Their plan was to destroy the French defenders by sheer weight of firepower. But the French defenders refused to be overwhelmed. They repaid the Germans shell for shell, so that the infantry of both armies succumbed to a mutual martyrdom. Men became mere pygmies under the towering rage of these bombardments. Some were blown apart, and no trace of them ever found. Others were piteously mutilated by chunks of flying iron. Dugouts collapsed and buried their garrisons alive. Men were picked up bodily, thrown into trees, slammed against walls, or killed even by the flying fragments of their own comrades' bodies. This was death, but this was death without a shred of human dignity. It was death in mud and squalor and excrement and entrails. Death of men at the mercy of the machine.
Quand vous avez des bombardements effrayants comme vous en aviez, quand les obus vous tombaient dans tous les coins, tout autour, eh bien, vous attendiez le vôtre. Vous attendiez la fin. Ça, c'était une question de... on était terrés complètement. On était dans la terre. On ne savait plus où se fourrer. Et puis, moi, on était là, attendre la dernière minute. C'était l'attente, quoi. Avec la frayeur et tout. Mais ça y est, il y en a quelques-uns qui ont attrapé la dysenterie. Hein. Il y a des morts autour de vous, vous étiez obligés de vivre avec. Il n'y a pas moyen de faire autrement. Parce que les morts, on les enterrait quand on pouvait. Les enterrer, on en mettait 2, 3 dans le trou, et puis on remettait la terre par-dessus. Mais ils revenaient à nos buts, ils redéterraient les morts. Et puis vous preniez des beefsteaks, comme on dit, de pourriture, de chair pourrie, qui vous arrivait, qui vous en étiez couvert. Des fois, c'était une infection. C'était une infection. L'odeur, c'était quelque chose de terrible.
Also under intense bombardment throughout the battle were Verdun's ring of forts, bastions of defense, which both sides looked upon as specially significant trophies. The most famous was Fort Douaumont, turned by the artillery of both nations into a battered hulk, and still preserved in its wartime state as a memorial to the battle, and as a shrine to those who lost their lives there, many of them permanently entombed in closed-off galleries within the fort. Its machine gun posts and observation points still glower at the landscape across which the enemy attacked in 1916. It's a strange experience to walk through these grim corridors, once occupied by men whose ordeal was every bit as great as that of the infantrymen who cowered on the open ground outside. The French lost the fort to the Germans in the first month of the battle, after which they did everything in their power to win it back. Indeed, Fort Douaumont has been described as the most shelled spot on the surface of the earth. Imagine what it must have been like in these dark and weeping corridors in 1916. Today they're empty, but then they were filled with thousands of war-exhausted, apprehensive men. When the French launched their first attack in May, they brought to bear 300 guns on this fort alone. The air was thick with cordite, the noise so intense men went deaf. One survivor said it was like being inside an enormous drum. In their second attack in October, the French introduced 2 enormous railway guns, whose shells alone weighed 1 ton each. These slammed into the fort with devastating accuracy and precision. Some burst right through the armor and exploded inside. Finally, the German commander, realizing that not even here the lowest levels of the fort were safe anymore, had no option but to require his men to withdraw. It has been estimated that Fort Douaumont claimed the lives of 100,000 men. Many of the French who died there are buried in the vast cemetery that has been constructed nearby. A French officer wrote of those who took part in the Battle of Verdun,
"They will not be able to make us do it again another day. That would be to misconstrue the price of our effort. They will have to resort to men who have not lived out these days."
The iron face of the First World War could not altogether stare down the gunner's jaunty pride in his horsemanship and spectacular panache in bringing his guns into action. No gunner could forget that Napoleon, greatest of generals, had been a gunner, and there were many would-be Napoleons in all armies of the Great War. In the official order of precedence that determines the British Army's hierarchy of regiments and corps, the Royal Horse Artillery, when on parade with guns, takes first place over all others. The King's Troop Royal Horse Artillery forms in such circumstances the British Army's right of the line. Here it is rehearsing on a murky London morning in khaki uniforms scarcely different from those in which it fought at the epics of Neri and Le Cateau in 1914. No great occasion, whether the opening of Parliament, the Queen's birthday, or the visit of some foreign dignitary, is conceivable without the Horse Artillery's distinctive contribution.
Number one!
There are other symbols of the Royal Artillery's corporate pride, glittering trophies of past victories or tokens of gunner piety, brought out from the richest collection owned by any British regiment to decorate the dining table of the Woolwich Mess, the gunner's ancient London home. At the end of the room, the Royal Artillery Band plays throughout the evening. Dinner over and the table cleared, the port circulates in preparation for the drinking of the loyal toast, in a manner unique to the Royal Regiment of Artillery.
All glasses have been charged, no? Thank you very much, Mr. Pink.
Gentlemen, the Queen, our Captain General.
Another tradition is unique to British gunners. The colours they venerate are the guns they serve in battle. Gunners therefore guard their guns with their lives, and in doing so they come to love them as totems of their own identity. Perhaps no gun has attracted as much affection as the 25-pounder, the British Army's standard field gun in the Second World War. The Australians felt the same affection for it, or perhaps a little less when manhandling it over the ridges of the Owen Stanley Range in New Guinea in 1942. The 25-pounder's first great success was in Eritrea, where in 1941 at the Battle of Keren, it helped to rout a well-dug-in Italian army. Keren created an immediate bond between gunners and gun.
It was a weapon that we picked up suddenly, and within 7 days we were using it on the enemy. Now, the 25-pounder was a great gun. It was a wonderful weapon. The story of the gunner is the story of the gun. We towed it around the world, we dragged it, we lived in its service, we supported it, we cleaned it, and when nothing else was left, we reluctantly blew it up. No, there was nothing better than a 25-pounder. Not in my book, anyway. She was a beautiful weapon.
By contrast, there is no worse blow to artillery pride than being overrun by a far more powerful enemy, with the grim choice of either fighting your guns into the ground or destroying them. And this happened in the Western Desert in June 1942 to the same 25-pounder regiment which had fought so superbly in Eritrea. The action has gone into history as the Battle of the Knightsbridge Cauldron.
It's a long time since the Cauldron, but I can still remember quite vividly the shells hitting the gun position, the soft vehicles in the rear going up in flames, the screams of the men on the guns, the smoke and noise, which was pretty terrifying.
The thing that sticks in my mind is this tremendous flash of a gun not very far away, and then this horrific noise of armor-piercing shells flying past, guns, shields being burst to bits, layers collapsing with limbs all over the place and livers falling out of the side, and another man immediately pulling him aside and jumping into the laying seat.
From the time that we were joined the gunners, we were taught that it was a tragedy and a disgrace to spike your gun, but as a last resort, this is the thing you must do. And so on the fourth gun, which is the one that I was firing, I eventually I put a shell in the breech and fired, but the charge was faulty. The tanks were coming in very close. They were something like 50 yards away, and German infantry were advancing on the flanks. And so I could do no more than take out the breech mechanism, which I hid in the slit trench which we had dug during the morning. So I don't think that particular 25-pounder would have been any use to anybody.
Normandy, invaded by the Allies in June 1944, challenged the Allied artillery to find and destroy the German garrison in a landscape ideally suited to defense. And new mobility was part of the answer. While most of the German artillery remained horse-drawn, even the Allies' heavy guns were now mounted on pneumatic-tired carriages pulled by four-wheel drive tractors or big lorries. Moved at speed, they could also be rapidly deployed and brought into action. Some guns had now become armored vehicles, self-propelled pieces, which provided the mechanized units with their artillery support. One of them, the Sexton, mounted the famous 25-pounder on the equally famous Sherman tank chassis. But radio was the greatest step forward in artillery communications. Its universal adoption freed gunners from depending on vulnerable telephone cables. The nerve center of the system was here, in the artillery command post, where fire orders were worked out from target information received. It came from a variety of sources. From air observation post officers circling the battlefield in Oster spotter aircraft. From sound-ranging microphones buried in the earth that could plot an enemy's gun position to within 15 yards. And from artillerymen out forward with the infantry. As the infantry advanced, so too did the forward observers, keeping in constant touch with the gunner command posts through their man-pack radios. Target information collected by the radio network allowed the command post officer to orchestrate the mass of guns at his disposal into a whirlwind of fire. Russian soldiers have long been devotees of artillery. In World War II, they fielded more guns than any other army. Here, Stalin's God of War celebrates a Soviet triumph. The Red Army pushed to extremes the technique of massing artillery on a chosen front of attack for an overwhelming preliminary bombardment. The aim was to eliminate all resistance and then rush a torrent of tanks and infantry through the gap in the enemy line. These tempests of gunnery underlay the Russian victories at Stalingrad, Kursk, and Berlin. But different campaigns, as always in history, produce different techniques. In Vietnam, set-piece bombardments were quite inappropriate to the fluid, will-o'-the-wisp fighting.
What the artillery did provide to the infantry and the other maneuver forces was the same thing that it has provided since time immemorial, and that is simply that we provided a big morale boost to the infantry types. Whenever the infantry would be held up by perhaps only one or two enemy soldiers shooting at them with small arms, rather than continue to be held up and taking any unnecessary casualties, the first thing that the infantry would think of is, where's the artillery? And in several instances, this was artillery used in a direct fire role against a house or some other structure. And we would fire the weapon, and the building and its inhabitants would be destroyed, allowing the infantry to move on and continue with their operation. In one of the units to which I was assigned, our mission was to provide fire support to a reconnaissance insert. This would be a group of infantry types who would be inserted a fair distance from an operational base, primarily to collect information on enemy movements. They were out there in small numbers, very limited self-defense capability on their own. So what they had to rely upon and what gave them that morale boost was the artillery. We were there come rain or shine, unlike Air Force assets that in some cases could not fly. We were always there, and we were their security blanket, if you will.
In all the mechanized armies that garrison NATO's Central Front in Germany in the 1980s, artillery has been completely integrated into the pattern of high-speed armored operations for which NATO forces train. This, here in service with the British Army, is the American-built M110, conceived on the same principle as the Sexton of World War II, but far more mobile, and mounting the nuclear-capable 210mm howitzer. This is the M109, an American-built 155mm howitzer, also used by the British Army. The men manning this vehicle might be the crew of a naval gun turret. Certainly the techniques of laying and loading are the same as those of gunnery at Jutland and Leyte Gulf. But the power the gun packs, it too is nuclear capable, makes it a weapon of the future rather than the past. It belongs to a trend that makes artillery a more formidable battlefield weapon than ever before.
I think that probably the 1980s are the most exciting time that the field artillery has ever had since the turn of the century. And this gets back to when we first had indirect fires with the French 75 that all of us used in World War I. Today, we're in an era where technology has given us the microchip. And the electronic industry has added precision to our communications, to our guidance, to the entire way that we operate.
Squat's good. Send it down.
Long gone is the time where we are depending upon the human eyesight to acquire targets with a forward observer that would be with the infantryman or the tanker. We still use him, but he has enhanced optics, night vision devices, and etc. But more importantly, we have counter-battery radars that can look 30 to 40 kilometers deep into the enemy's rear to detect artillery firing at us. In addition, the remotely piloted vehicle that the Israelis used in Lebanon is an example of the technology we're working with. And again, satellites. Satellites are of course used in the strategic sense, but all of the technology that we have certainly will allow us to use satellites in the tactical battle and not just the strategic battle. So I think those things will provide us overabundance of artillery targets, and all we have to do is have the munitions and the wherewithal to attack them.
This is the kind of wherewithal now available, the MLRS, or Multiple Launch Rocket System. Derived from a Russian design of the Second World War, it concentrates the firepower of 18 orthodox artillery systems into a single unit. Its crew of 3 can bring it to its firing point launch all its rockets, and be off again in less than a minute. The MLRS perpetuates and extends the timeless roles of artillery in war.
In battle, the artillery has always had two roles. In defense, its purpose is to destroy the impetus of the enemy's attacks. And in attack, its task is to destroy the enemy's will to resist. Just that. And whether you consider the medieval wars, or the Napoleonic wars, or the great wars that followed them, those two tasks have remained. And whether you think about missiles with homing heads, or shells that can find their own way to the target, or any of the other emerging technologies, those two tasks still remain, and there is no other arm on the battlefield that can perform them. But today, in fact, we are thinking less about battles than about deterring war as a whole. And in that context, too, the formidable power of the artillery, its destructive effect, and what I can only call the authority of the guns, represent one of the most effective deterrents of them all.
For the future, for years now, artillery has had this kind of ultimate power. This is an atomic cannon of 30 years ago. The power of its equivalent 30 years hence is unimaginable. Meanwhile, conventional artillery continues to grow in mobility, rate of fire, range, precision, destructive power, making battlefields more and more dangerous for the human being to inhabit. But artillery now threatens to carry its power beyond the battlefield, and perhaps to put the future of the world into the barrel of a gun. It is with artillery, said Napoleon, that war is made. Would he today, contemplating how the weapon he valued so highly has grown to overawe its creators, feel that war should not be made at all?